Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Today, I'm chatting to Sydney-based writer Ashley Kalagian Blunt. Ashley's writing has been published in eminent journals and publications such as the Griffith Review, Sydney Review of Books, The Australian, The Big Issue and Kill Your Darlings. Her non-fiction manuscript Full of Donkey Travels in Armenia was shortlisted for the 2018 Impress Prize and the 2017 Kill Your Darlings Unpublished Manuscript Award. Her upcoming novella and associated essays, My Name is Revenge, published by Spineless Wonders this year, was a finalist in the 2018 Carmel Bird Digital Literary Award and has just been shortlisted for the 2019 Wallara Digital Literary Award. Her family connection to a little-remembered but significant historical event sparked nearly a decade of research and writing, resulting in this thought-provoking exploration of a legacy of genocide. I'm delighted to welcome Ashley to the podcast today. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Congratulations. You've had some amazing feedback on the book so far. You must be so proud of the reception it's already getting.
I'm really happy with the response to it, and particularly the reviews it's received. People who have written the reviews saying that they learned so much about the Armenian genocide from the book, that's the reason I wrote it. I wrote it because I met so many people who knew so little about this event or had never even heard of it. And I just felt like it's a really important piece of history in understanding how the 20th century was shaped and understanding even events that are going on today, including geopolitics, related to Australia. So I'm really pleased that the book's been so well received, and that people not only are finding it something that they're learning from, but also that it seems like people are really enjoying the story and really enjoying reading it.
Absolutely. I loved the story, and there's so much to unpack in it. There's so many themes. More than 100 years on, these themes continue to resonate in the modern global political arena. I fear that we won't have time to discuss everything that I'd like to today, but let's start with the Armenian genocide that began on the 24th of April 1915 under Ottoman rule. This is the primary theme of your novella and one you've highlighted as a little known or understood event of the 20th century. Can you tell me what sparked your interest in this subject?
My great-grandparents were survivors of the Armenian genocide. And I say that, and I imagine that people think that was then something I knew about growing up. But my great-grandparents when they arrived in Canada in 1920, lived in a community near Niagara Falls. And that's where my grandfather grew up, and that's where my dad grew up. But then my dad joined the Canadian military, and so I lived in Western Canada. I didn't live anywhere near my Armenian family. And because my dad didn't speak Armenian, I had very little conception of myself or my father as being Armenian. I didn't know what that was. And so I was quite removed from it. But even my dad, who grew up in the community, he didn't know about my great-grandfather's survival of the Armenian genocide until after my great-grandfather died. So this was his grandfather who he grew up around. Partly because there was a language barrier there. My dad spoke very little Armenian. My great-grandfather spoke very little English. But even so, my great-grandmother was fluent in English. It was just something that there was so much shame around and that wasn't openly discussed amongst the family. So I found out about this when I was 15, and finding out that something like that, and I go into my great-grandfather's story and the essays in the back of the book, but finding out about that kind of violence, like that level of violence at that age when you're very impressionable, but also that it was something that had always been in my family but I'd never known about, and not that it was hidden, just that it wasn't discussed. So that left a huge impact on me. And then later on, and so that was something I was like, I should read more about this. And I did. I went and read more about this. But then later on, when I was in my 20s, I met someone from Turkey. And, she was my age. But that meeting someone from Turkey and the emotional reaction that I had told me that there was something unresolved about this thing that I knew about my family and this history that had happened in the world. And that's really what launched me to start investigating that. And that process of investigation began 10 years ago and resulted in 2 books, 2 manuscripts, Full of Donkey, which is still unpublished, but which you mentioned earlier, and then My Name is Revenge, which is this collection of work that has now been published.
Fantastic. Now, for listeners who haven't read your book yet, can you tell me a little bit more about the book itself?
Sure. The book is in 2 parts. The first part is a novella, and it is literary crime, literary thriller. It starts with a assassination that took place in Sydney in 1980, and that was a historical event. I took it from the newspapers at the time. So December 1980, 2 men were assassinated near Vaucluse in the early morning. One was the Turkish consul to Australia, working in Sydney, and the other was his bodyguard. And they were assassinated by an Armenian terrorist group. And that crime remains unsolved today. And it's been largely forgotten. I did a talk recently and there was a crowd of Aussies, and I asked, who remembers this event? And I actually got about like half the room maybe put their hands up and said that they recalled it happening. So that's the starting point. And then the novella goes in and imagines the people who could have been responsible for those events. So it imagines 2 Armenian Australian men, their brothers, and it looks at the bigger picture that this terrorism was part of, because this terrorism was part of a worldwide movement that started in the mid-1970s and went through till the early 1990s and involved over 200 terrorist actions in North America, in the Middle East, in Europe, and here in Australia. And of course, that terrorism was related to the fact that the Armenian genocide happened during World War I. The Ottoman government was responsible for it, and the Turkish government that rose from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire still denies it to this day, and denies it very actively and aggressively. And so this group of terrorists in the 1970s decided that they would draw attention to that and try to force the Turkish government to acknowledge what had happened, to acknowledge the historical truth through violence. And I was particularly interested in that because, we hear about terrorism so much in the news these days. But for me, this was the first time that I intimately understood the motivations of these terrorists, because they're the same motivations for my writing about this topic. So I understood the motivations, but of course I couldn't relate to the methods. And that intrigued me so much that I started thinking, I really need to write about this. So that's where the novella came from. And then the 3 essays in the back are different approaches to thinking about the Armenian genocide and providing that sort of background. If you've never heard of this event, well, here's a primer on it. But it's not just a historical primer. It's also it's interspersed with memoir about my family, about this Turkish woman that I met in my 20s, about my time in Armenia and what I learned there, as well as there's an essay that puts the Armenian genocide into the historical spectrum of genocide across human civilization. Because I think that's one thing we don't do enough. I think that we talk about the Holocaust a lot, and we talk about big events like that. But I think it's really important to put them in the bigger picture of how they've changed and evolved along with human civilization. And I'm really passionate about, when we talk about this, that we talk about that bigger picture. So that's what the book's attempting to do is draw all those huge concepts together into one slim volume.
Look, it's fascinating, and I have to say I'm always intrigued by the impetus for writers to write fictionalised accounts of historical events and the way these stories seem to thrive in modern society. We seem to have a thirst to understand our past, and that doesn't seem to be abating anytime soon, which is evidenced by this like stratospheric rise in the popularity of the historical fiction genre. And I think, you know, war in particular and the millions of innocent lives lost to the territorial, ideological and political battles waged by world leaders continues to draw readers from around the world. And obviously, this is something that you've considered when you turned your mind to writing this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my feeling was if I tried to write a history of the genocide, A, there's already lots of great histories of the genocide out there. But B, I wanted to bring this into the Australian imagination. And so I felt that I could do that more effectively by writing a really gripping story, a story that has really great pace. Like, I love crime thrillers. I know you're a fan of Candace Fox. I'm a big fan of Candace Fox too.
Yeah.
So I wanted to see, could I write something with that really gripping pace that fiction is so great at, but pull people into the history and make them then want to know about the history. And that's some of the feedback I've received on the book, is that by the time you reach the end of the novella, there's so much that you want to understand, and then the essays are just waiting there for you to explain.
So Vrej, he's a complex character. On the one hand, he's passionate about his identity and of the need to draw attention to the role of modern-day Turkey in the annihilation of the Armenian people and the continued denial of the fact of the Armenian genocide. He feels the frustration, the disaffection, but he can't bring himself to accept the idea that violence can be resolved with violence.
So when I started writing the novella, I attempted to write it from the point of view of his brother, Vrej's brother, Armin. But Armin is a character who has no qualms about committing violence. And I found that was just, for myself, a bridge too far, because I'm in no way a violent person at all. So I struggled with Armin for quite a while. And then I discovered this technique in fiction. And it's actually one that Kate Grenville uses in The Secret River, which is where you write from the point of view of the lesser violent character. And that allows you to bridge that gap. So Vrej has this tendency toward violence, which he's gotten from the family that he's grown up in. But he himself is not totally comfortable with that. So he's looking at his heroes and he's looking at his idols and he's looking at his goals. And he's trying to figure out how he can navigate all of these things in a way that is comfortable to him, that a way that is moral to him. And one of the things I try to do with Vrej is think about the people who must have been like that during the genocide, you know, the people in the Ottoman government who had those qualms, who were not comfortable with what was happening. And there's a lot of historical records about people like that. And in those cases, in the Ottoman government, often they were just removed from power. And it would have been the same thing, you know, with the Nazis in Germany. So that's where I was coming from with Vrej. And in the end, he attempts to resolve that difficulty within himself in a very dramatic way.
Yeah. I feel that this is such an important part of the modern geopolitical discourse, I think. You're talking about events that occurred early last century, but they continue to resonate into this century in an era when terrorist attacks are sadly more commonplace. It's a fine line to walk, isn't it? That desire to empathise with the cause, but condemn violence as a way of bringing it to light.
It's really tricky. And in fact, I had one person in my family read this book and was convinced that I was advocating for this type of violence, which of course is not the point of the book. But it is tricky because I think, especially for Armenians today within the community, there's this feeling that this event is fading into the past, and it is hard to get people attention to it when there is so much else happening in the world today, and so much else has happened in the past century as well. But as you said, it is something that still is impacting geopolitics, and I think because of that, we do need to pay attention to it. It is a major factor in the way the Turkish government interacts with other governments around the world. And Turkey is, I mean, such a significant nation. So it is something that, even just from that political point of view, we should pay attention to.
You refer expressly to a number of times to that continued denial of the Armenian genocide, but not only by the Turkish government, but also other governments around the world, which begs the question of what resources, apart from the anecdotal, did you uncover in your research?
Other governments like Australia haven't acknowledged it. It's not that they don't believe it's true, it's just that acknowledging it is a political step that would cause issues with the Turkish government, so they haven't taken that political step. But that said, the New South Wales state government has acknowledged it, the government of Victoria has acknowledged it, I believe South Australia as well. It's complicated. But in terms of resources, there's a fabulous book that was published in Australia a couple years ago by New South Publishing, and it's called Armenia, Australia, and the Great War, and it was co-written by Viken Beb-Kenyon, who's an Armenian-Australian historian, and Peter Stanley, who's an Australian military historian. And what they did was they delved into Australia's historical record through the newspapers and other media, as well as into war diaries at the Australian War Museum, for example. And they found, I mean, there was an incredible relief effort here in Australia, and their book details this amazing relief effort, because the Armenian genocide, when it was happening, was so well known around the world. There was news coverage about it all the time. It was covered in all the major Australian newspapers, and there was this, really Christian response to the suffering, and so money was raised, and flour and other goods, and there was even a Australian orphanage opened in Syria for Armenian orphans at the time, and Australians went over to staff it. It was an incredible effort. So there is a huge wealth of archival evidence, and I mean, that's just talking about the Australian case. Around the world, like Germany, because they were allied with the Ottoman Empire in World War I, that Germany has an incredible archive of information, and academics there have been researching that and publishing books about it. So in terms of evidence, this is what frustrates, I think, everyone in this area, is there's so much evidence, and yet Turkey continues to say, oh, but it's not true.
Yeah, I understand. So along with the genocide, I mean, you deal with the theme of dispossession, and one of my favourite parts in the book is when Vrej he wonders what Australia looked like when only occupied by Aboriginals. And of course, he's making reference to the dispossession of the Indigenous peoples, something which he can obviously relate to. And this is also something that continues to affect world politics today, isn't it? I mean, you were born in Canada, and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples there continues to be an issue.
It's a really interesting case with Armenia, because the land that Armenia is on today are their traditional homelands. But Armenians as a group probably only go back about 3,000 years, which particularly, I mean, in compared to Australian Aboriginal culture is really nothing. And there were probably other groups there prior to the Armenians. That land, I mean, is traditional Armenian homelands, but they're not the only peoples there. So there's, I mean, Kurdish peoples there as well, and many, many other groups. So when Armenians talk about their homeland, they talk about it as this unified thing. But I think it's much more complicated. Whereas you come to Australia, it's not that complicated at all. It was, Australian Aboriginal for 60,000, 80,000 years potentially, and then suddenly there was this, disrupted destiny effectively when the British arrived. So I wanted to make sure that I raised that in the novella, because that's the land Vrej's story unfolds on. And Robert Mann has a great essay about the Armenian genocide and the denial, and he theorizes that there might be a relationship between Turkey denying the Armenian genocide, and how in Australia we struggle with the, particularly at a federal government level, we struggle with the dispossession of Aboriginal from their lands. And that essay is really powerful. I highly recommend it.
Now, I wanted to, change directions slightly and ask you, what made you decide to become a writer?
Oh, I think I always loved writing. One of my earliest memories is writing, some stupid little story as a child. I was 6 or 7, and it was a school assignment, and the school published a compilation of the students' work. So my first publication is from when I was 7 years old in Young Saskatchewan Writers. and it's just this silly little story about a wizard who turns some kids into frogs that I'm pretty sure is plagiarized from a children's book somewhere. But I remember that feeling of excitement of seeing my story in this real book. And so I went into university to become a journalist because my parents felt that was, it was 2001. They still felt like journalism was possibly a good career path. Was probably right at the end of that thinking. But I discovered journalism was not for me. And then I sort of put the idea, by then I'd written 2 manuscripts for novels, but I wasn't connected to the writing community in any way. I didn't really know what to do with those 2 novels. And I had other ambitions at the time, so I went and lived abroad. I lived in Asia for a year, and then Latin America for a couple of years. So it wasn't until I moved back to Canada and got married that I thought, what do I actually want to do with my life? And that's when this idea of writing came back to me. And that's also when that's when I met this Turkish girl and started thinking, I need to explore this in depth, and writing offered me a way to do that. So I think it was the dovetailing of those 2 desires that led me to start taking my writing seriously and develop a writing practice. And by then I'd moved to Australia, and there was a writing community, an amazing, wonderful, incredible writing community here to connect with. And that gave me the support that I needed to pursue this path. So I'm really lucky that it all came together in that way.
No, it's fantastic. And you recently appeared at the Sydney Writers' Festival. Tell me about that.
Oh, that was incredible. I was there to moderate a panel called Home Truths, which featured Fiona Wright and Luke Carman, who are both Sydney-based authors who have new essay collections out right now. Mm-hmm. And both of their essay collections deal with chronic illness. And so I think because I have a chronic illness myself, I think that I was asked to moderate the panel, as a writer with chronic illness, because it certainly didn't have anything to do with my book. Mm-hmm. Like, being at Sydney Writers' Festival sort of acknowledged my emerging status as a writer. Like, it definitely marked a moment for me where I could say, okay, I have progressed this far and reached this certain point. And so being there was really gratifying, I suppose, and just so great to be part of the community in that way.
You work for Writing New South Wales, and I wanted to ask you, as an emerging writer and a published writer at that, what, if any, advice do you have for other aspiring writers out there?
This is my favorite topic. Well, first of all, connect with your State Writers' Centre. State Writers' Centres are a great resource, and at Writing New South Wales, we're very happy to help. But that said, okay, so for aspiring writers, connect with the community. I think and probably if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably already doing that. So keep doing that, because that's been the best part of my journey. Not just it's been the most helpful, definitely, because I've learned so much from the community, but also it's just brought me the most joy. And even if I never had anything published, I think I would keep writing, in part just to be part of this amazing community, because I love it so much. But in terms of practical advice, one thing that's really interesting about My Name is Revenge is that I didn't write it as a book. I've written 5 other manuscripts. This is my first published book, but it was actually written as separate pieces, 2 of which were published individually. So one of the essays was published by Griffith Review in 2015, and one of the essays was published by Sydney Review of Books in 2017. The novella I wrote separately. I didn't imagine that it would be published on its own. And it hasn't been published on its own. It's published in part of a collection, in part because it's not really that long. So for aspiring writers, keep trying everything. You know, when I sat down to write a book, but then I thought, oh, well, maybe I could take this section and turn it into a standalone essay, and maybe I could write about this from the perspective of memoir, but maybe I could write about this from the perspective, from a fiction angle. And so by trying all those different things, I think I really improved my voice. I got some short pieces published, which was really encouraging. So if you're writing and you feel stuck, like, I always just try something else. I always just try another thing. And my other tangible, practical piece of advice is to have rejection goals. So have you heard of rejection goals before?
I haven't actually.
Oh, rejection goals are fantastic. So a goal really is something that you're setting that you can achieve. So if I said my goal was to appear at Sydney Writers Festival, well, I can't really make that happen on my own. Like, someone else has to step in, the people who run Sydney Writers Festival, and say, like, yes, we would like to have you. But so a goal should be something that you can do. So rejection goals are like setting goals to basically submit a number of pieces of writing. So your rejection goals for the year might be 12. Mm-hmm. And basically that's saying, I'm going to send out 12 pieces of writing, and probably most of them are going to get rejected. And so instead of vying and trying and putting all your hope on getting a piece accepted somewhere, you're just trying to reach this number of rejections, which is much more tangible and in your power. And of course, if you're doing it, I mean, you could do that really poorly, and you could just send things out to places, you know, you could send a nonfiction essay to a place that only publishes poetry. That's not the point.
Yeah.
You're trying to send things out to places where they may actually accept them. But it's a way of sort of flipping the script in your mind so that the rejection doesn't hurt as much. It still hurts a little. And if you feel like you can take that on as an approach, I highly recommend it.
Oh, I'm going to look it up. Thank you very much for the tip.
Oh, you're welcome.
Now, I wanted to ask you whether or not you were working on anything else at the moment.
Oh, I am. I'm always working on things. I'm very excited right now because I've been working on a book since 2015 called How to Be Australian. It's a memoir about moving to Australia from Canada, and like thinking that I knew what Australia would be like, because Australia and Canada, they're not that different. Turns out they're very different. So it's a comedic memoir, and that is the surface level, but actually it's about learning to adult, learning to cope with anxiety, learning to be married, because I'd just gotten married before my husband and I moved here. So I right now have a publisher who's interested in it, so I'm working on some edits for her at the moment, so that may turn into a publishing contract at some point, or it may not, and that's okay too, because even just having a publisher interested in it and asking me for edits is like, that's hugely exciting. So I feel like I've already achieved something really big this year. So I'm very happily working on those edits.
Fantastic. That's very cool, Ashley. If listeners wanted to find out a little bit more about you and your books, where could they find you?
I am all over the internet. I have a website, which is ashleyKalagianBlunt.com. Although apparently if you search endocrine system of donkeys, you will also get my website.
Okay, good to know.
There's a hot tip. I have a newsletter. I have an e-newsletter that goes out once a month that has really great author giveaways, so great book giveaways that your listeners might be interested in. And I am on social media.
Ashley, it was truly fabulous to talk to you today, and I wish you every success. And thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, thank you for having me on your fabulous podcast.
It was wonderful. And listeners, for a chance to get your hands on a signed copy of this thought-provoking debut, head over to my Instagram account and follow the directions to enter the draw to win. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.